The clock froze at tea time, and so did someone's fate. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me where you're listening from. Your voices keep this mystery alive. I can't wait to see your comments. Let's begin. If you're trying to slip a surprise into Nero Wolfe's brownstone, address it to him personally and choose a time when he's not supposed to exist. That limits you to somewhere between 11 and 12, when he's with the orchids, and 4 to 6, when he's still with the orchids. The rest of the day he exists too much to be surprised. The parcel showed up at 3:57 p.m., which is practically a felony in that house. Fritz was balancing a tray of lemon cookies and a pot of Yunnan gold like a diplomat smuggling a treaty when the front bell went off with its special obstinate whine. I was at my desk in the office, watching the second hand on the wall clock bully its way toward 4. Wolfe was in the chair, mountain range configuration, eyes at half-mast. He was tolerating the tea because the cookies were new and Fritz had cajoled him with cinnamon. Fritz, with a look that asked me to start earning my keep, set the tray down and headed for the front. The bell went again. Whoever it was, they had the nerves of a man who double parks outside headquarters with the engine running. I went to the hall, opened the door, and found a bicycle messenger with a face like a spare tire and a rectangular package that looked important on account of how it had 3 kinds of string and a red wax seal featuring a lion who'd lost the vote. Delivery for Mr. Nero Wolfe. Signature, the kid said. He had a cleft in his chin you could park a dime in. I signed Archie Goodwin, his man Friday, Saturday, and parts of Sunday, which the boy didn't read. When I carried the parcel back into the office, Wolfe's eyelids performed a small rebellion and rose another 1/4 inch. He doesn't care for deliveries arriving during sacred hours. He likes his world to be a chess problem, 90% stationary, the rest labeled. Who dared? He asked, not moving his neck. A bicyclist with calves like a cello, for you, and you might want to lift that eyebrow the rest of the way. There's a wax seal with a coat of arms that says, "We owned a moat once and we're not over it." I put the box on his desk, avoiding the magazine pile he calls current filth, and reads anyway. The label was written in a hand that cared about its reputation. Mr. Nero Wolfe, private inquiry, 918 West 35th St. to be opened at tea time. Tea time, I said. We are either the victims of British humour or about to become godparents to a scone. Wolfe regarded the inscription as if it had interrupted a sonnet. Fritz, he said without raising his voice. The tea. It is ready, sir, Fritz answered from the doorway, sounding like a man who had already foreseen doom and preheated the oven for it. If you open that, Wolfe told me, do it on the tablecloth. I don't wish to have crumbs of England in my desk. I checked the seal, genuine wax, impressed deep. The lion had a fish in his mouth, which seemed excessive unless he had stock in a tartar sauce company. I took my penknife and introduced New World efficiency to Old World ceremony. Under the wax and string was a wooden box the color of librarians. The lid slid back with a hiss like a disapproving aunt. Inside was a carriage clock. Polished brass case, beveled glass on all 4 sides, white enamel face with Roman numerals, and hands that were indigo when the light caught them right. The top had a little folding handle. It wasn't new. It was the kind of piece that had lived above a mantel where people said things like Cousin Hillary and the grouse was late this year. It was ticking, not loudly, just enough that the ticks lined up with the second hand of our wall clock as if they had agreed not to embarrass each other. There was a note tucked under the base, heavy cream paper, the kind that makes you adjust your tie before you touch it. I slid it out and read, "To be opened at tea time, as requested, and delivered to Mr. Wolfe before the hands can be moved. Do not attempt to wind. Do not tamper. Respectfully, M.L." Tea time, I repeated, because it seemed to be the day for it. And before the hands can be moved. The hands can't be moved if it's ticking. Wolfe gave me a look that wouldn't have blistered paint, but might have unglossed it. There are forms of movement we call vulgar. Tampering would be one. Reading is another, if done aloud before I have tea. I took the hint and poured. He lifted his cup as if it were a legal document and sipped. The cookies mollified him enough that he lowered the cup without judgment. I set the clock on the table, where its little heart went tick-tick-tick like a discreet confession. At 4:02 the front bell rang again. Wolfe made his face into a geography of resignation. You will see who presumes to multiply. This time it was neither boy nor bicycle. The woman on the stoop had the kind of coat that thought well of itself without needing you to agree. Pale gray, cut sharp. She had hair the color of a penny that had been lucky too long. Mid-30s, eyes that could do mental arithmetic in a hurry. She wasn't rattled by seeing me, which is always a point. She held out a calling card like a referee tossing a coin. Miss Manurva Lake, I read. Lake Antiquarian and Advisory, Horology, Applied Provenance, and my time-sensitive disputes. That last line is either a joke or a business plan. Come in. She came, and her shoes didn't make noises they couldn't afford. In the office, she glanced once at Wolfe and once at the clock on the table. The glance at Wolfe took longer. People liked to see if the stories went easy on him. They didn't. Mr. Wolfe, she said, stopping just where. Strangers stop before they realize the chair won't be offered. I apologize for the intrusion during your orchid hours. I was told 4 o'clock would be both impolite and effective. You were misinformed, Wolfe said. It is entirely impolite, but possibly effective, she said, and didn't smile. Wolfe's head came forward a fraction, which, if you've never seen it, is like watching a glacier notice a ship. Madame, we have tea. Say your piece. Ms. Lake didn't sit. She looked at the carriage clock, listened to it, and let her shoulders drop a hair. You received this a few minutes ago, she said. You opened it at tea time as the label required. You did not wind it or adjust the hands. Thank you. If you're going to thank us for everything we did not do, I told her, I'll make a list. It's a long one. She turned, taking me in, and filed me under necessary menace. Mr. Goodwin, I presume. I'm relieved the parcel arrived. If it didn't, I was prepared to throw myself at your front door like a late newspaper. Why the dramatics? I asked. We're usually reachable with 2 nickels and a telephone. Because I couldn't risk a call being traced, she said, and because at 4:06 the clock was still ticking. I needed it to come into this room ticking. She checked her watch and the carriage clock as if they had been introduced once at a party and hadn't hit it off. May I? Wolfe tapped an impatient finger against the chair's armrest. If you mean to touch that object, first you will identify yourself more completely and state your business with a succinctness appropriate to the hour. She nodded. Manurva Lake. I advise museums, estates and collectors on acquiring and deaccessioning timepieces. I also, occasionally, negotiate disagreements when a clock or watch is alleged to have been altered, forged, or used to mislead. 3 years ago, I was retained to authenticate a group of French carriage clocks for the patron committee of the Finch Museum. One of those clocks is in front of you. It is authentic. It is also a message. It has been used to extort someone I care about. I sent it to you because I believe you can read the message, and because your house is the one place in New York where a clock can stop without the police immediately taking possession. Extort, Wolfe repeated, as if the word had a foreign flavor he didn't enjoy. Yes. Minerva's voice stayed level, but her fingers had started folding and unfolding the top of her glove with little crisp sounds. A private club called the Penumbra, cultural patrons, benefactors, bankers, meets weekly for tea. The Finch's board chair is a member. So is the museum's director. So am I, although lately I've regretted spending the dues. Yesterday, during tea, an argument over a pending gift, an estate pledge from a man named Ambrose Klein, grew heated. At exactly 4:15, the club's mantel clock stopped. It was a joke. Someone had switched it with a copy wire to stop at that time. Everyone laughed. The tea resumed. At 6 p.m., the museum director received a photograph of a ledger page, Mr. Klein's legacy, along with a demand. If the Finch didn't make a certain appointment to deaccession a 19th-century English marine chronometer, the photograph would go public, along with allegations that the Finch had knowingly taken a disputed piece a decade ago. The appointment specified was today at 4 o'clock, tea time, with a named intermediary picking up the chronometer to resolve the dispute. That intermediary's name was mine. Ah, Wolfe said. Convenient. Compelling, Minerva corrected him. This morning, an anonymous package containing this carriage clock arrived at my office, with a letter instructing me to have it in the room where the decision is made at exactly tea time. The letter said that if the clock was not present, the appointment would become unnecessary, because the Finch would wake up to scandal. I am not an intermediary in blackmail. I sent the clock to you instead. Then I came myself. I turned the note we'd found under the clock face down and nudged it toward her. This one yours? She scanned it. Yes, my initials. Manurva Lake. I wrote that in case the courier got waylaid and someone tried to wind or set it en route. Why the warning? I asked. It's a clock, not nitroglycerin. It might as well be. She stepped closer, finally, and, with a question in her eyes toward Wolfe, reached into her coat pocket to pull out a loupe. May I inspect it, without moving the hands? Wolfe angled his head. Briefly. She bent, the loupe in one eye, and the clock got the kind of attention that makes an object feel like it finally has an alibi. French, late 19th century, she murmured. 4-glass case, Mercury pendulum. The dial is signed Mercier, Rue de la Paix. Genuine. There's a second signature scratched inside the rear plate, nearly invisible. The person who stopped the club mantle yesterday is telling me this is the pair to the one he switched. It isn't. This is the original penumbra clock, and it's been regulated to lose precisely 1 minute every 20 minutes. It will stop at 4:20 if it began ticking at 4. She straightened, and her eyes were not doing math anymore. They were doing worry. Which means that when it stops, someone will interpret the time as a decision. Or as a signal, I said. Signal to whom? She asked. To whoever is watching the clock, I said. And if you intended it to be watched at the penumbra, sending it here rerouted the gaze to us. I hope we're dressed for it. Wolfe made a sound in his throat that was either a grunt or a papal bull. Miss Lake, he said, you said someone I care about was being extorted. The museum, the director, you. None of the above, she said. Quick. Her hands had quit worrying the glove and were now flat against her coat, as if holding something in place inside. Ambrose Klein's daughter, Iris. She is 26, a conservator at the Finch. She and I worked together. She was in the tea room yesterday when the mantle stopped. She was the one who laughed first because she thought it was a harmless gag. She's now being told to keep silent and let me handle the deaccession or her father's ledger page. His notes about restricted funds and pledges will be leaked to a columnist who enjoys moral thunder. And why? Wolfe asked, closing his eyes as if to spare them effort. Do you bring this here? Why not the police? Because nothing has been stolen yet, she said, and nothing written in the letter admits a crime. The Finch won't call the police unless something goes missing. The penumbra won't acknowledge that anything happened at all. The clock is a prop in a private show. I believe whoever engineered this expects me to deliver the chronometer at 4:15, the same time the mantle stopped yesterday, as a demonstration of obedience. I won't. And I can't have Iris. The carriage clock made a small hiccup in its ticking, like a man adjusting a lie. My eyes flicked to it. 4:11. The second hand was fattening into a minute it wouldn't get to finish. Wolfe opened his eyes and looked at Miss Lake as if he had been waiting for that sound, and to be honest, had found it a touch late. "You are correct," he said. It was impolite and effective. "Mr. Goodwin." "Present," I said. "You will call Mr. Panzer and tell him we may require his services later," Wolfe said, bland as a menu. "Then you will accompany Miss Lake to her club. You will not enter unless invited, and you will not invite yourself. You will observe. Dress like a man who owns a tie and does not hold it against the tie." "Today?" I asked. "Today," he said. "This is tea. The whelps who have done this have set a schedule. We will not make them wait for their tea to cool and discover themselves bored." He turned to Manurva Lake. "You will leave the clock here. You have allowed my house to be the stage upon which your antagonists expect to read a cue. That is intolerable, but instructive." "I'm not trying to endanger you," she said. It didn't sound like apology. It sounded like a line she'd already said to herself in the mirror and found unsatisfactory. "You will not," Wolfe said. "If someone is watching this house for a signal, they will learn that bombast does not rate an audience. Mr. Goodwin, escort Miss Lake to the penumbra and discover if the mantle there also enjoys theatrics." The clock's second hand flirted with 4:12 and then stuttered, fell behind itself, and went on resentfully. Fritz, who had been very quiet, balancing a tray with a calm that could have settled a nation, cleared his throat. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "if the clock stops here, what?" "It will stop," Wolfe said, "at such a time as its regulator intends. If this is a cue," and he looked at Manurva Lake, "they will have to guess what scene it brings on when played in a different theater." Miss Lake took a breath that rebuttoned something inside her. "You'll take the case." Wolfe closed his eyes again. "If you haven't seen him do it, it looks like retreat. It's not. It's an advance without motion." "I will offer my attention," he said, "which is rarer and therefore more expensive. $25,000, payable when I have ceased to be interested. Or sooner, if you wish. Mr. Goodwin will arrange the preliminaries with you on the way. Fritz, more tea." "25, she began, then shut it with professional grace. "Agreed." I got my hat, the good one, and the notebook, also the good one. At the door, I picked up her card. "Lake Antiquarian and Advisory," I read. "Time-sensitive disputes. You weren't kidding." "I never kid about time," she said. Then softer, "And I never kid about Iris." "Noted," I told her, "because sometimes you say the truth when you can't promise anything useful." I held the door. "Let's go keep tea time from becoming hammer time." Behind us, as Fritz refreshed Wolfe's cup, the carriage clock ticked on, pretending it didn't have an appointment to keep. The penumbra wasn't my usual hangout. I prefer places where the drinks don't cost a week's wages and you don't have to check your tie against a mirror-polished doorman before going in. But Manurva Lake wasn't the type to sweat over neckwear, and since Wolfe had ordered me to observe, I was condemned to play gentleman escort. The cab ride downtown was short and quiet. Manurva used the time to adjust her gloves like she was tuning an instrument. She didn't look at me, which was fine. I wasn't in the mood for small talk until I had a handle on what we were stepping into. The penumbra occupied a converted townhouse just off Madison. Discreet brass plaque by the door, lights low, curtains drawn against the daylight like it was an unwelcome salesman. Inside, the staff glided the way staff in clubs always glide, seen only when required, forgotten instantly after. The parlor smelled of polish, bergamot, and people who liked their reputations kept tidy. Manurva paused at the entrance, her eyes scanning the room. She was looking for someone specific, and from the little hard line at the corner of her mouth, she didn't like what she found. "They've already started," she murmured, more to herself than to me. She gave a sharp nod to a host in tails who guided us toward the tea room. I followed, notebook in pocket, eyes open. Wolfe wanted observation. He'd get it. The tea room had about a dozen people, all arranged as if they had come to drink civility along with tea. Silver trays, porcelain cups, a centerpiece clock on the mantel. Another brass carriage clock, twin to the one sitting smugly on Wolfe's table uptown. Minerva's hand brushed her coat pocket. I guessed she was feeling for the absence of the one she'd sent to Wolfe. Her eyes flicked to the mantel. The clock ticked, innocent as a lamb. I did my usual sweep. 4 men in suits cut too well to be bought off a rack. 2 women who radiated boardroom frost, and 3 more who looked like the sort of patrons who thought funding a museum gave them license to decide which paintings counted as art. At the head of the table, silver hair slicked back and face smooth as money, was Ambrose Klein himself. He was older than I expected, and his eyes looked tired, but they didn't miss much. His daughter, Iris, sat beside him. Early 20s, quiet, her eyes on the tablecloth instead of the clock. Minerva's jaw tightened when she saw her. I took the seat nearest the door. It wasn't offered, but I took it anyway. If anyone noticed, they decided not to contest it. I set my hat on the chair beside me and let the role of observer settle in. Wolfe would want details. Who shifted when the clock ticked, who looked nervous when the silver spoons rattled, who seemed too calm. I gave him all my attention, silently, in advance. At exactly 4:15, the mantel clock's second hand stuttered and froze. A little ripple of amusement went through the room, polite chuckles like last night's encore repeated. Someone said, "Again?" and another replied, "A tradition now." But not everyone smiled. Iris Klein stiffened. Her father's jaw clenched once, a visible pulse in an otherwise composed face. Minerva looked straight ahead, hands folded, as if bracing for something only she could see coming. Then the host entered with a folded envelope on a silver tray. He placed it in front of Ambrose Klein, bowed, and left without comment. The room went still. Klein opened the envelope, read the page inside, and for the first time since I'd seen him, looked shaken. He slid the paper toward his daughter, who went pale as she read it. Minerva didn't move. No one else breathed. Klein cleared his throat. "This matter is private," he said, voice steady but a notch too low. "If you'll excuse us." Which was a fancy way of telling the others to finish their tea and vanish. They did in 2s and 3s, murmuring polite exits, leaving the 3 of them, Klein, Iris, and Minerva, plus me, the uninvited. I stayed in my chair until Minerva's eyes flicked to me, once, as if measuring whether I was part of her side of the ledger. Then she said quietly, "Mr. Goodwin is with me." That was enough. Klein looked at me like you'd look at a card pulled from the wrong deck, but he didn't argue. He passed the note across the table. I picked it up and read, "The museum's chronometer will be collected tonight. Refusal means disclosure. This is your final hour, no signature." Just a time scrawled at the bottom, 5:20. That gave us an hour to figure out what Wolfe always insists on having before dinner, a reason. And if there's one thing I know about Nero Wolfe, it's that he never lets the clock run out without playing his move. Ambrose Klein didn't waste words. After I finished reading the note, he tapped the table with one blunt finger and said, "You'll deliver that to Wolfe. If there's a man who can decipher rot, it's him. Minerva, I assume you brought him into this against my express instructions." Her chin didn't dip. "I did. And if you'd had better instructions, you wouldn't be staring at ultimatums scrawled on club stationery." That got a muscle twitch in his cheek. Iris, who had been clutching the envelope like it might burn her, put it down carefully, as if afraid sudden movement would trigger something. "Father," she said softly, "it's my fault. I laughed yesterday. They think—" "Stop," Klein said, not loud, but with enough weight to press the air flat. "It is not your fault." He looked at Minerva, then at me, and for a man who valued control, the concession cost him. If Wolfe is engaged, then this matter leaves the penumbra's carpet and enters his brownstone. Good. Better there than here. I pocketed the note with the kind of casualness that was meant to be noticed. Don't worry, Mr. Klein. Wolfe has a way of arranging matters so the guilty hang themselves, usually without mussing his vest. I expect nothing less, Klein muttered, though his eyes weren't on me. They were on his daughter, who looked like she wanted to vanish into her teacup. That hour Wolfe had mentioned was ticking away. If the messenger came at 5:20 expecting to collect a 19th century marine chronometer and found instead a crowd of anxious patrons, we'd know what game they were playing. But Wolfe wouldn't want me sitting still just admiring clocks. He'd want suspects, contradictions, and dirt. So I did what Archie Goodwin is paid to do. I got moving. I stepped into the hall before Minerva could object, and I started collecting impressions. The members who had scattered after Klein's dismissal hadn't all gone far. 2 men lingered by the coat check, one tall and sandy-haired, the other shorter with a banker's paunch. Their conversation went silent the moment I stepped in, which was all the introduction I needed. I strolled by, giving them the once-over. The tall one's name came to me. Roderick Vale. Lawyer, one of those who liked being described as in cultural circles. He had the habit of pinching his lower lip when he thought, which he was doing now hard enough to leave a dent. The paunch belonged to Milton Sorrell, banker, donor, and rumored to have turned a tidy profit, arranging discreet loans for museums in distress. Both men had the taut look of insiders who knew more than was healthy. "Evening," I said, friendly as a bartender. "Fine weather for extortion, isn't it?" They blinked. Vale cleared his throat. "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing," I said, grinning. "Just a thought. Don't let me interrupt." And I kept walking, but not before noting the quick, uneasy glance they exchanged. Upstairs, I tracked down another face from the tea room, a sharp-featured woman in a dark green suit who carried herself like a boardroom sword. Eleanor Gresham, chair of the Finch's board. She was alone in a side parlor, staring at a row of portraits like they'd all personally disappointed her. "Miss Gresham," I said, stepping in. "Archie Goodwin, assistant to Nero Wolfe. You probably guessed. I was wondering, when the mantel clock stopped yesterday, what was your reaction?" She didn't flinch. Mild annoyance. I dislike theatrics. "But you laughed." She turned, her eyes a cool slate. So did most of the room. It seemed harmless. Only later did it prove otherwise. That's how these things work, isn't it? They begin as amusement. Her voice had the brittle edge of someone trying to keep her nerves from rattling. I gave her a nod and left her to her portraits. Wolfe would pass her tone later like a chef testing a sauce. I made one more round, catching sight of Julian Adler, the museum's director, a gaunt man with a scholar's stoop. He was pacing in the library, muttering to himself, "Not again, not again." I didn't interrupt. Sometimes you learn more from silence than questions. By the time I returned to the tea room, Minerva was with Iris, murmuring low, calming her, while Klein sat stiff as a general awaiting orders. The mantel clock still showed 4:45, its hands frozen in yesterday's joke, but the real time was advancing fast. I leaned against the doorframe, notebook in hand. Wolfe would want a full roster. Vale, the lip-pincher, Sorrell, the paunchy financier, Gresham, the frosty chairwoman, Adler, the muttering director. Each had been in that room when the first clock stopped. Each had something to lose if the Finch's secrets spilled. And each now was waiting for a delivery that Wolfe had already hijacked. At 5:10, I excused myself, found a phone, and called the brownstone. Fritz answered. His voice was steady, but there was something in the background. A faint, metallic silence that told me the carriage clock had stopped. "Mr. Wolfe is expecting your report," Fritz said. "Tell him it's 4 suspects and counting, with the Kleins caught in the vice. And tell him I added, that in 10 minutes someone's coming for a chronometer that isn't leaving the Finch unless Wolfe says so. Fritz paused. He says, observe carefully the expressions when the messenger arrives. They will betray more than words. Which is Wolfe for don't miss a beat, Goodwin. I hung up, straightened my tie, and walked back into the tea room. Everyone was gathered again, waiting. The clock on the mantel was frozen. The silence was thick enough to chew. And somewhere, outside, a watch was ticking toward 5:20. The minute hand on my watch nudged past 5:18, and you could have heard the upholstery breathe. Ambrose Klein sat ramrod straight, the folded note in front of him like an unwelcome house guest. Iris stared at it too, pale, knuckles pressed to the rim of her cup. Minerva was composed, but I could tell by the faint rhythm in her tapping foot that she was measuring time down to the grain. I had stationed myself by the mantel so I could catch faces all in one sweep. Wolfe's instruction was simple enough. Observe. What he really meant was, don't blink when the trap door creaks. At 5:20 sharp, the sound came. Not a bell, this wasn't that kind of house. A knock, firm and businesslike, echoed from the club's front door. Everyone in the tea room jolted a fraction, like a string pulled tight. Even Ambrose, who had been pretending to be granite, flicked his eyes to the hall. The host appeared, discreet as always, and with him a man who looked like he had walked out of a shipping ledger. Narrow face, grey suit too loose at the collar, and a portfolio under one arm. The host announced him with a faint bow. Mr. Lyman Drew, to collect on behalf of the Finch. That was a neat piece of gall. Announce him as though he were expected, as though we had all signed off on the charade. Klein's eyes darkened. Minerva didn't move. Iris shrank back against her chair. Drew stepped forward, voice clipped, rehearsed. The chronometer. I'm instructed to take possession. He placed a sheet of paper on the table. Typed, neat, unsigned. It read like a receipt drawn up by someone who thought legitimacy was a matter of margins and carbon copies. No one spoke, so I did. Interesting you're collecting from the Finch. Only this isn't the Finch. It's the Penumbra, which makes me wonder how you knew the right address to knock on. His gaze flicked to me, cool and brief, but his hand tightened on the portfolio. Arrangements were made. I'm not here to explain them. The chronometer, please. I glanced around the table. Vale and Sorrel had drifted back into the room, pretending to hover innocently near the doorway, but their eyes were fastened on Drew with more heat than courtesy. Gresham stood in the corner, hands clasped, her mouth pressed tight. Adler, the director, had reappeared too, lingering in the shadows like he'd come to witness his own execution. Wolfe had told me faces would tell more than words, and he was right. These people looked at Drew like he was the gun they'd hired, but didn't want to see go off. Ambrose Klein finally spoke, his voice thick as gravel. There will be no handover. If you have instructions, you may return them to whoever sent you and tell them they've misjudged their leverage. Drew blinked once, then calmly set down his portfolio, opened it, and removed a single photograph. He slid it across the table toward Iris. She gasped before she even picked it up. Minerva leaned over her shoulder, caught sight, and her lips went thin as wires. "What is it?" Klein demanded. Iris's hands shook as she held it out. "It's... Father, it's your ledger. The page with the restricted funds. They've photographed it." The room went still as a courtroom verdict. Drew closed the portfolio with a snap. 5 minutes, he said flatly. Either the chronometer is produced, or this goes public. It will not be contained to gossip. You know what that means. I watched him as he said it. He was steady, but not smooth. There was a twitch at his temple, a stiffness in his jaw. This wasn't a man built for threats. It was a man reading a role he'd been handed. And the way the others looked at him, Vale's lip caught between his teeth, Sorrel's fingers worrying his watch chain, Gresham staring daggers into the carpet, suggested that if Drew was the mouthpiece, one of them had written the script. I stepped away from the mantel, slow enough that all eyes came with me. "The trouble with deadlines," I said, "is that they make people nervous, and nervous people slip. So let's settle something before Mr. Drew here checks his watch." Who first suggested this grand charade of clocks and tea time? "Because I can tell you one thing." I pointed at Drew. "This fellow didn't dream it up on his own." That landed like a stone in a pond. Ripples of silence, then Vale coughed, sharp and guilty. Gresham's hands clenched tighter. Adler muttered again, "Not again." Manurva glanced at me with the faintest nod. "Keep pressing." Drew straightened, portfolio under his arm again. 5 minutes, he repeated, and turned to leave, but his ears were red now. Red ears mean pressure. Pressure means someone behind him pulling strings, and Wolfe would want me to yank hard enough to see which string snapped first. I didn't follow him out. Instead, I turned back to the room, took in every face, every posture, every bead of sweat. This wasn't Wolfe's office with its neat chairs and symmetry, but it might as well have been. The suspects had gathered, the clock was ticking, and all I had to do was deliver the full tableau back to the brownstone. Because when Wolfe finally spoke, it would be checkmate, and he'd want the board exactly as I left it. I stayed where I was, leaning just enough against the mantel to look casual, but not enough to miss a twitch. Drew's footsteps retreated down the hall, clipped and sharp, the sound of a man too conscious of the seconds he had left. The silence he left behind was heavier than his words. Vale cleared his throat again, an old habit trying to pass for composure, but the sound was too loud in the hush. Sorrel tugged once more at his watch chain, eyes fixed on the carpet like it might spell out a way through. Ambrose Klein broke the quiet. "No one will produce the chronometer. If you have any doubts, rid yourself of them now." His voice wasn't loud, but it had the finality of stone dropping in a well. The Finch's collection is not a pawn shop for blackmailers. That was noble, but Iris's face said she wasn't sure how noble would look when tomorrow's papers ran her father's ledger across the front page. Minerva reached for her hand under the table, steadying her while she herself looked at Klein with something halfway between admiration and fear. I filed it away. When people admire and fear the same man, the balance tips depending on what secret they share. Eleanor Gresham finally spoke. "Mr. Klein, stubbornness does not erase reality. If the chronometer is not given up, the Finch will bleed reputation for years. We will lose donors, programs, credibility. It isn't only your name at stake, it's the museum's survival." He turned his head slowly toward her. "And if we yield once, Eleanor, what stops the next demand, or the one after? Shall we auction the museum piece by piece to keep your boardroom tidy?" That earned him a glare sharp enough to trim hedges. I'd seen that kind of exchange before. Two people who had both rehearsed the same argument from opposite ends and now had to perform it in public. It meant Gresham had more to lose than she let on, and Klein knew it. Adler, still skulking in the corner, piped up with a thin voice. "Perhaps if we delayed, created the impression of compliance, while discreetly—" He trailed off when all eyes turned on him. He wilted back against the wall, muttering again, "Not again." That caught my ear. "What do you mean, not again?" I asked him, casual but sharp. He blinked rapidly, like a man woken from a dream. Nothing. Nothing." But the way his hands twisted at the hem of his jacket said otherwise. "I didn't press it here. Wolfe would want it teased out later in his own arena." My job was to notice. At 5:23, the silence was broken by the faintest shuffle in the hall. Drew hadn't gone far. He was waiting, giving them time to crack under their own weight. A clever move for a messenger, or more likely, a move taught to him by someone cleverer. Minerva leaned closer to me and said quietly, "Wolfe needs to know exactly how divided they are. They won't unify now. Every minute drives them further apart." She was right. Gresham looked like she might risk open mutiny against Klein. Sorrel was sweating into his collar, no doubt counting the cost of scandal against the cost of appeasement. Vale was chewing his lip raw, lawyer brain racing for legal deniability. Adler looked like a man standing on a bridge that had collapsed once already. I let the tension stretch until 5:25, then straightened. "Ladies and gentlemen, Nero Wolfe will want a faithful account of what's happened here. That means every flicker of indecision, every noble stand, every suggestion to yield. You've all provided plenty of color." I tapped my pocket where Drew's counterfeit receipt still sat. "But Wolfe will also want facts, and I've got one for you. The chronometer isn't going anywhere tonight. It's under more watch than your bank vaults." That earned me a mix of relief and suspicion. Iris's shoulders sagged, Gresham's eyes sharpened, Vale muttered something about liability, and Sorrel wiped his forehead like I'd told him the hangman was on vacation. Klein nodded once. "Goodwin, tell Wolfe he has my full confidence, and my fee." I tipped my hat. Already in motion. I didn't wait for further debate. I stepped out into the hall and, sure enough, Drew was there, pacing like a man rehearsing lines. He stopped when he saw me. "Well?" he demanded. I gave him a grin. "No sale today. Come back with better paperwork." His eyes flashed, but he swallowed it. Without another word, he turned on his heel and left, shoes striking the floor like a metronome. I watched him go, then headed for the phone again. Fritz answered on the first ring. "He is waiting," Fritz said, and passed the receiver. "Report," Wolfe's voice came, calm as if I were describing the menu instead of a standoff. I laid it out. Drew's entrance, the photograph, the 5-minute ultimatum, the suspects' reactions one by one, and Klein's stone refusal. When I finished, there was a silence on the line that wasn't absence. It was Wolfe arranging his pieces. "Pfui," he said finally. "Goodwin, return with Miss Lake and the Kleins. Bring the note and the photograph. The others may stew in their own vinegar for now. I will see the principal parties here. The rest must be summoned later, under my roof, where foolishness is less free to multiply." That was the order, and when Wolfe gives an order, the next step is never in doubt. I pocketed the phone, found Minerva and the Kleins, and told them Wolfe expected company. Ambrose hesitated, but Minerva's glance at Iris decided him. He rose, straightened his coat, and said only, "Then let us face him." It was 5:40 when we stepped out of the penumbra. The evening air felt fresher, like the city itself was keeping time while the clocks inside froze. We hailed a cab, 3 of us in the back, me up front. As we drove uptown, I watched the faces reflected in the glass. Ambrose grim and unreadable, Iris pale but holding Minerva's hand. Minerva herself calm, but with eyes lit by something I hadn't seen before, resolve, or maybe dread. Wolfe's brownstone was waiting, and so was he. And if there's one truth about Nero Wolfe, it's this. When the world brings him a puzzle, he doesn't wind the clock. He stops it, listens to the silence, and then makes it strike the hour he chooses. The cab moved north through the dusk, headlights slanting off wet pavement, and for a while no one spoke. That silence was loaded, not the easy kind you settle into on a long ride. Iris leaned into Minerva, her hands folded tight in her lap as if she were keeping them from betraying her thoughts. Klein stared. Out the window, the glow of storefronts reflecting off his glasses, his jaw locked like it had been cast. I decided the silence was getting us nowhere. "Mr. Klein," I said, "you've got a poker face. But if I'm taking you into Wolfe's office, you'll want to be prepared. He'll ask what that ledger page shows exactly. If there's dynamite in those numbers, it'll be better for him to know before he starts lighting matches." Klein's eyes shifted to me. slow as if considering whether I was worth the courtesy of a reply. "The ledger," he said finally, "contains notations regarding restricted funds pledged to the Finch, funds earmarked for specific purposes. If the notes were misread, they could suggest—" He stopped, lips tightening. "They could suggest impropriety." "Impropriety like misappropriation?" I asked. He didn't answer. Iris did, in a low voice. "They'd say my father diverted donor money, that he built programs with funds meant for acquisitions. It isn't true, but—" her voice caught. "It could be made to look true." Klein's glare silenced her, but the words were out. Manurva smoothed Iris's hand with her thumb, not looking at Klein at all. The geometry of the three of them told me something Wolfe would enjoy: affection crossing diagonals, authority pressing from above, and in the middle, the vulnerable one holding the piece that might decide the whole board. I leaned back against the seat, letting the city blur by. Then it isn't just a clock or a chronometer. It's leverage, and leverage always points back to someone with a motive. Tonight, Wolfe will start measuring who benefits most if that page sees daylight. My job is to make sure he has all the players lined up in focus. Klein gave me one of those curt nods meant to dismiss further commentary, but I wasn't put off. Silence, after all, was more telling than words. By the time we reached the brownstone, the air outside was heavy with the smell of rain threatening. Fritz opened the door before I had to knock, ushering us in with his quiet efficiency. His eyes lingered briefly on the clock still sitting on Wolfe's table, its hands locked in obedient stillness. The room smelled faintly of orchids and roast beef, the kind of juxtaposition that belonged to Wolfe alone. Wolfe was in his chair, planted like a monument, eyes half closed, lips pressed in their usual compromise between disdain and patience. He didn't rise when we entered. He never does. He gave us one brief survey, his gaze flicking from Klein to Iris to Manurva, and finally to me. "You have brought them," he said. It wasn't a question. "Straight from the penumbra," I replied, laying the note and photograph on his desk, with Drew's 5-minute ultimatum still hanging in the air and a room full of suspects busy sweating through their collars. Wolfe opened his eyes a fraction wider to regard the photograph. He lifted it with 2 fingers, like it was evidence of the human condition rather than paper. "Crude," he muttered, "but effective enough for the timid." "Sit." Klein stayed standing, which was a rookie mistake. Wolfe let the silence stretch until even a man of Klein's age and presence had to lower himself onto a chair, though he did it with the stiff grace of one who thought he was making a concession. Iris sat next to Manurva, close enough that their shoulders touched. Wolfe turned his gaze on Klein. "You will state succinctly the danger this page represents, without embroidery." Klein hesitated. "It may appear I misallocated restricted funds." "Appear?" Wolfe asked, one eyebrow twitching. Klein's voice hardened. "Appear. It is a matter of notation and interpretation. The facts would not condemn me, but appearances would. Those who despise me would find it enough." "Enough for scandal," Wolfe said. "Not enough for prison. That distinction matters." He shifted his eyes to Manurva. "You, madam, why did you divert the clock here instead of to the club as instructed?" Her voice was even, though her hands were folded tight. "Because the clock was a prop in a play I wanted no part of. Because Iris would have been made complicit if I obeyed. And because your house, Mr. Wolfe, is the one stage in this city where such a performance cannot run unchecked." For the first time, Wolfe allowed the corner of his mouth to curve. Whether in approval or irony, I couldn't say. A flattering exaggeration. Still useful. "And you, Miss Klein?" Iris startled. "Me?" "Yes," Wolfe said. "Why do you suppose you're at the heart of this? Why was it you who laughed when the clock stopped? And why is it you who tremble now?" She swallowed. "Because I was foolish. Because they saw me laugh and thought I could be drawn in. Because my father—" She cut herself off, eyes wide, Wolfe's lids lowered. "Because your father is the fortress, and you are the gate. Yes, that is often how it is arranged." Klein bristled, but Wolfe lifted a hand, stilling him without raising his voice. "Mr. Goodwin, you will summon Mr. Panzer and instruct him to shadow Mr. Drew. He is not the architect, merely the courier, and the leash must lead back to a hand. In the meantime, the principles of this affair must be brought here, into this room, where pretense cannot escape its own echo." "Meaning Vale, Sorrel, Gresham, Adler," I said. "And any other parasite attached to this carcass?" Wolfe added. He leaned back, closing his eyes again. "The clock has stopped. It will be my business to declare what hour it is." The room went still. Fritz entered quietly with a tray, pouring beer for Wolfe and offering coffee for the rest. Minerva accepted. Iris, too. Klein refused, his jaw still tight. I took mine, black and hot. It looked like we were in for a long night. The first act was over. The next would begin when Saul picked up Drew's trail and the Ios. Penumbra's polished masks walked through Wolfe's door, and if there's one thing I knew better than any of them, it was that Wolfe would make them all wish the clocks had never stopped ticking in the first place. Wolfe's instructions were always spare enough to leave me holding the details, which is why I found myself at the hall phone 20 minutes later, dialing Saul Panzer's number. Saul doesn't waste syllables either. He agreed to take the Drew assignment with nothing more than "describe him" and "where he left you." I gave him the details, down to the loose collar and the portfolio under his arm, and Saul grunted once. That was the sound of assurance. When Saul grunts, it means he'll find his man even if the earth swallows him whole. When I came back into the office, Wolfe had shifted barely half an inch, but his eyes were open. Ambrose Klein had his arms folded like he was in a boardroom waiting for a vote. Iris sat close to Minerva, their heads almost touching. Fritz had discreetly brought a plate of sandwiches, untouched except by me. I was hungry enough to keep my hands occupied, and Wolfe knew it, which was why he ignored the chewing. "The sequence of events," Wolfe said, voice rolling like distant thunder, "is designed for theater. A mantle clock stops, an ultimatum is issued, a messenger arrives with counterfeit authority. At every stage, the purpose is not acquisition, but pressure. Pressure measured against appearances. That suggests one of two motives: to compel surrender of the chronometer or to destroy reputations when surrender is refused. Which of those is more plausible, Mr. Klein?" Klein drew himself up. "The chronometer is valuable. To some collectors, irreplaceable. But this," he tapped the photograph on the desk, "is aimed at me. This is not about money. It is personal." Wolfe grunted. "Perhaps. But men who crave money dress their lust as vendetta. Conversely, men who crave vengeance drape it in finance. Mr. Goodwin, you observed the suspects' faces when Drew made his ultimatum." "I did," I said. Vale looked like he'd chewed off his lip by mistake. Sorrel sweated through his collar, Gresham tried to glare her way through the floorboards, and Adler muttered about something happening again. None of them looked pleased, but none were shocked either. "That last," Wolfe murmured, "is important. If none were shocked, then all anticipated some form of coercion. Therefore one among them, or more, shared complicity with Drew. Mr. Klein, what dealings have you had with those four outside the Finch?" Klein considered, then spoke with the measured tone of a man accustomed to testifying. "Vale has been legal counsel to the museum on minor contracts. Sorrel has floated short-term loans to stabilize cash flow in the past. Gresham, chairwoman of the board, deeply invested in reputation and donations. Adler, of course, is director and susceptible to pressure." "Susceptible how?" Wolfe asked. Klein's lips thinned. "He has misstepped before. Poor acquisitions, questionable deaccessions, matters that could have cost him his position if not for intervention." "Yours?" Wolfe pressed. Mine, Klein admitted. I could feel Wolfe soaking that in like gravy. Adler muttering, "Not again," suddenly had more weight. That was the kind of string Wolfe liked to tug at until the whole skein unraveled. The phone rang, sharp in the hush. I caught it on the first ring. Saul never wastes time. His report was as concise as a telegram. He'd followed Drew from the penumbra to a modest apartment on 81st, where Drew had spent half an hour on the phone, pacing like a caged animal. Then Drew had slipped out again, this time heading toward a brownstone on East 70th, registered to... Saul paused for effect. Milton Sorel. Drew hadn't gone in through the front. He'd taken a side entrance like a man who knew the way. Saul was watching the house now. I relayed it all, and Wolfe's eyes opened wider, the glimmer of satisfaction unmistakable. Good. That confirms what was already likely. Sorel is the purse, Drew the instrument, but who composed the music? Not Sorel. He lacks imagination. Likely he partnered with one more astute, perhaps one who craves both leverage and removal of Mr. Klein. Gresham, I said. She practically begged Klein to fold at the table. She looked like she'd sign away the whole Finch to keep her boardroom tidy. Wolfe inclined his head. Possibly. Yet she's too obvious. Often the one who seems most eager to yield is simply playing the role required to ensure suspicion falls elsewhere. That is why they must be brought here, all of them. Only under scrutiny, deprived of their allies' silence, will the guilty reveal themselves. Iris shivered beside Minerva. But won't that put me at risk if they know I'm here? No, Wolfe said firmly. It will shield you. To strike at you here, under my roof, would be beyond audacity. It would be suicide. That reassured her more than Klein's steady hand on the table. I could see her shoulders ease slightly, though her eyes stayed on the frozen clock as if listening for a sound it wouldn't give. Wolfe turned to me. Archie, arrange their attendance. Tell them they are required here tomorrow at 10 in the morning. No exceptions. You may imply that refusal will be interpreted as admission. That's a trick I enjoy, I said, but you know half of them will try to wriggle out. Then pin them, Wolfe said, and closed his eyes again. We are done for tonight. Fritz, dinner. That was Wolfe, for the stage is set. The suspects didn't know it yet, but they had already walked onto it, and when Wolfe summoned them, they would learn what every man and woman eventually learns in that office, that there are no curtains to hide behind when Nero Wolfe is directing the play. After dinner, Wolfe retreated upstairs to the orchids, leaving me with the delightful chore of rounding up 4 people who would rather have swallowed nails than show up at the brownstone on Wolfe's schedule. It wasn't the first time I'd played town crier for him, and it wouldn't be the last, but it still takes some tact when your invitation is really a subpoena without the badge. I started with Vale. The lawyer answered his phone with a clipped Vale speaking that sounded like he was cross-examining the dial tone. I laid it out plain. Mr. Nero Wolfe required his presence tomorrow morning at 10 sharp concerning the matter of the Finch and the penumbra. Vale's breath caught once, quick and shallow. He tried the usual legal dodges, asking whether this was voluntary, whether he should bring representation, whether Wolfe had the authority. I let him burn through his stock phrases, then dropped the line Wolfe had armed me with. Refusal would be taken as admission. That shut him up. After a long silence, he muttered, "Very well," like he was agreeing to eat cold spinach, and hung up. Next was Sorrel. By then, Saul had already reported back that Drew was tucked inside his house like a mouse in a pantry, which meant I could press harder. When Sorrel answered, his voice was oily with false geniality, the kind of tone bankers use when they're charging interest. I gave him the same line, only with less sugar. He stammered something about important appointments, but when I told him Wolfe knew exactly where Drew had spent the evening, his words dried up. He cleared his throat, promised he'd come, and tried to laugh it off, but the laugh was more cough than chuckle. Adler was third. The director picked up sounding like he hadn't slept in a week. When I told him the time and place, he said, "Not again," in the same tone he'd muttered at the club, only now it sounded like a confession instead of a complaint. He didn't argue, didn't bargain. He just said, "I'll be there," as though inevitability had already signed him in. That left Gresham. I knew she'd be the hardest nut to crack. She answered with the crisp authority of someone used to running a boardroom. When I explained the summons, she laughed, a short, sharp laugh like breaking glass. "Mr. Wolfe has no authority over me," she declared. I agreed, but pointed out that if she failed to appear, Wolfe would simply announce to all interested parties that she had declined. The implication hung there. For a board chair who lived and died by reputation, the suggestion was enough. She hissed something about manipulation, but finally conceded, each word bitten off like it cost her teeth. She'd be there, though she promised Wolfe would regret dragging her into his private circus. That was the set. 4 reluctant guests, each pinned in their own way, all due at Wolfe's office at 10 sharp. I hung up the receiver, jotted down the notes Wolfe would want, and headed back into the office. The clock still sat silent on the table, its hands frozen as if listening for what tomorrow would bring. Fritz came in with coffee, and Manurva Lake accepted a cup, though her eyes were far away. Iris had gone upstairs to rest in one of the guest rooms. Fritz had prepared it with his usual care, fresh linens and quiet corners. Klein had refused both food and comfort, taking a stiff chair in the corner of the office like he was guarding the photograph on Wolfe's desk with his presence alone. I gave Wolfe the rundown when he came back down from the orchids. He listened without interruption, nodding once when I described each reaction. When I finished, he folded his hands across his middle and closed his eyes again. As expected. Tomorrow they will come. Their reluctance is as revealing as their presence. Goodwin, you will be ready with your notes. Miss Lake, you will remain at hand. Mr. Klein, I advise you to preserve your composure. Your bluster is less effective here than your silence. That didn't sit well with Klein, but Wolfe wasn't offering negotiation. Fritz brought up beer. Wolfe took his glass, and the evening settled into its usual rhythms, though the air carried more charge than most. I turned in late, but sleep wasn't generous. My mind kept running over the faces I'd seen at the penumbra, the way each had flinched or stiffened when Drew laid down his ultimatum. Wolfe had his net ready, but nets only work when the fish are lively. Tomorrow, they'd all be lively enough. Morning came grey and wet, a drizzle tapping the brownstone windows. By 9:30, the house was already taut with anticipation. Fritz fussed in the kitchen, Wolfe was ensconced in his chair, and I had the guest chairs arranged in their familiar half-circle, the arena where egos went to die. Iris remained upstairs, too fragile for the show. Manurva sat quietly in the corner, hands folded, watching Wolfe as though measuring how far she could trust a man who rarely moved. At 9:55, the doorbell began its duty. One by one, they came, Vale with his briefcase clutched like a shield, Sorrel mopping his brow under a hat too fine for the weather, Adler pale and stooped, and Gresham in a dark suit that declared she wasn't here to play along. I ushered them into the office, where Wolfe sat waiting, immovable as a cliff. When they were all seated, the silence stretched, that long prelude Wolfe favored before striking his first chord. The frozen carriage clock ticked in its absence, and every eye was drawn to it. Wolfe let them look, then finally opened his eyes. "Gentlemen, Madame, you know why you are here. I have no intention of repeating your own performances of ignorance. You will speak when spoken to, and until then, you will listen. The clock has stopped, and so have your pretenses. We shall see which of you began winding this farce." That was Wolfe's overture. The play had begun. Wolfe didn't open with questions. He rarely does. He let the silence work first, pressing down like extra gravity. Vale shifted in his chair and thumbed the clasp on his briefcase. Sorrel dabbed his forehead with a folded handkerchief and tried not to look like a man who had been caught with ink on his fingers. Adler sat hunched, eyes on the rug as if it might offer him an escape clause. Gresham crossed her legs sharply and fixed her gaze on Wolfe with the defiance of someone who thought sheer willpower could stop deduction in its tracks. When Wolfe finally spoke, his voice was slow and deliberate, the sound of a man dictating to himself. A clock stopped at the penumbra. Another arrived here. Both are symbols. Someone has elected to play with symbols because direct theft would have been too obvious. Yet symbols can be more damaging than knives. You four were present at the penumbra. You four have reason to fear disclosure of Mr. Klein's ledger. Therefore, you four will remain until I have satisfied myself which of you arranged this comedy of ticking and silence. Vale cleared his throat, eager to prove his usefulness. Mr. Wolfe, if you are suggesting I had any part... Phooey. Wolfe lifted a finger, and Vale shut up like a clerk before a judge. If you wish to exonerate yourself, you will do it by restraint, not protestation. Your lip, however, will not thank you for the abuse you inflict upon it. That got a twitch from Vale's hand as it dropped from his mouth. I marked it down. Wolfe was already turning the screws. Mr. Sorrel, Wolfe continued, your association with Mr. Drew is established. He entered your house by a side door last evening. Do you deny it? Sorrel's face blanched under its sheen of sweat. Drew has done errands for me before. Financial errands. There is nothing criminal, Wolfe interrupted smoothly, in employing a messenger. But there is much that is suggestive in employing the same messenger used to extort Mr. Klein, and more suggestive still that he comes and goes by your private door. Do you expect me to conclude coincidence? Sorrel opened his mouth, closed it, and reached for the handkerchief again. Wolfe let him stew in the damp silence. Adler finally spoke, his voice thin. You must understand, the Finch has faced scandals before. 10 years ago, there was an incident with a bequest, papers misplaced, rumors. He swallowed hard. Not again. I could not allow it again. Wolfe opened his eyes wider, the effect almost theatrical. Ah, at last, candor. You are suggestible, Mr. Adler, and pliant. Someone has pressed you into service before. But I suspect you lacked the spine to originate this stratagem. You were useful, yes, but not the author. Adler slumped, defeated by being accurately described. I could almost hear Wolfe pinning him to the wall without moving a muscle. That left Gresham, who hadn't flinched. Her eyes stayed steady, her hands neatly folded on her lap. Wolfe turned to her last, which was always deliberate. He liked the guilty to feel they had watched him dismantle everyone else before the spotlight reached them. Madame, he said, you have been most vocal in urging surrender. You are intelligent, and you know how reputation sways donors. If scandal struck, you would lose control of your board. If surrender were made, you would appear the savior. That is a tempting duality, is it not? Her lips curved, not quite a smile. Mr. Wolfe, if you mean to accuse me, be direct. I do not frighten easily. You should, Wolfe murmured. For all masks are thinner than their wearers suppose. You may deny, and perhaps deny convincingly. But the arithmetic of motives is inexorable. Someone sought to use Mr. Klein's ledger as leverage. Someone employed Mr. Drew, a man already tethered to Mr. Sorrel. Someone understood that appearances, more than realities, would crush reputations. Which of you fits those sums? The silence stretched again. Vale shifted. Sorrel's handkerchief fluttered. Adler sagged. Gresham's eyes held steady, but her knuckles whitened against the arm of her chair. I watched them all, noting every twitch. Wolfe wasn't after confessions yet. He was arranging the air, thickening it, letting their own nerves gnaw through the ropes. He would circle again, ask the precise questions, and by then the weak seams would be ready to split. He let them sit with that, closed his eyes, and breathed out heavily. We shall proceed carefully. Each of you has much to lose. Each of you is capable of deception, but one of you has already overplayed your hand. We will find which. Fritz stepped in with fresh coffee. No one reached for a cup. They all knew the game had begun, and Wolfe never lost once the pieces were on his board. Wolfe opened his eyes again and fixed them squarely on Vale. It was like turning a lantern on a moth. "Mr. Vale," he said, "you are trained to measure words, yet yesterday you laughed when the mantel clock stopped. Why?" Vale blinked rapidly. "Because everyone did. It seemed harmless. A prank." "Harmless," Wolfe repeated, drawing the word out. "You're too cautious to find mirth in pranks. You laughed because you already knew what it signified. Not in full, perhaps, but enough. Did Sorel explain it to you? Or Gresham?" The lawyer fumbled with his briefcase clasp, metal clicking under his thumb. "No, certainly not. I had overheard something, a remark that the clock might provide entertainment." "From whom?" Wolfe asked. Vale hesitated, then said, "Adler." The director's head snapped up, pale eyes wide. "That's not true. I said nothing of the sort. He caught himself, realizing his denial sounded more desperate than the accusation. His shoulders hunched lower, as if trying to vanish into the chair. Wolfe turned to him. "Then you were a pawn. Someone made you mutter their intentions, so you could be pointed to later as a culprit. Convenient, yet even pawns leave traces. When you said not again, you betrayed prior knowledge." "What was the earlier incident?" Adler licked his lips. 10 years ago. The museum acquired a collection under questionable terms. A donor threatened exposure unless we rectified matters. I was persuaded to go along. It nearly destroyed me. Klein intervened, protected me. Since then, I have dreaded repetition. That was enough to confirm Wolfe's earlier suspicion. Adler wasn't clever enough to design extortion, but he was useful clay. Wolfe let him sink back into his chair and shifted his attention to Sorrel. "Mr. Sorrel, your finances are robust, but not invulnerable. You have speculated poorly in recent years, yes? The Finch's gratitude would be a valuable counterweight. And Mr. Drew in your employ, what did you pay him to risk his skin in this masquerade?" Sorrel's handkerchief fluttered like a flag. "I didn't. Drew has his own dealings. I may have loaned him money, yes, but I never—" "Pfui," Wolfe cut him off. "A banker who claims ignorance of his courier is lying to me or to himself. Either is contemptible. He took your instructions, but he did not conceive them. You lack the imagination." That left Gresham. She had remained composed, but the faint pulse at her temple betrayed her. Wolfe leaned slightly forward, which in his case was the equivalent of pounding the table. "Madam Gresham, you claim Mr. Wolfe has no authority over you. Correct, but you have authority over the Finch, and you are not content with Mr. Klein's dominance. Scandal would unseat him, a forced concession would tarnish him. Either way, you would rise. The arithmetic points to you." She met his gaze, unblinking. "If arithmetic is all you have, Mr. Wolfe, then your vaunted genius is little more than sums and slander." Wolfe didn't react. He let the silence hang until even her steady stare flickered once. Then he closed his eyes again, signaling the end of this round. "You are all complicit to degrees, but only one of you orchestrated the charade. I will not pronounce now. Mr. Goodwin, see Mr. Panzer continues to observe Drew. There is more to learn. This evening, we reconvene. By then, the threads will have tightened." That broke the gathering. I ushered them out one by one, watching the way they moved. Vale hurried, clutching his briefcase like it might sprout wings. Sorrel lingered at the door, looking like he wanted to speak but thought better of it. Adler shuffled out hollow-eyed. Gresham paused longest, her voice low as she passed me. Tell your employer he underestimates me. That will be his mistake." Then she was gone, heels sharp on the steps. When the door closed, Minerva exhaled audibly, the first sound she'd made in an hour. "You've put them on edge. But will it be enough?" "It always is," I told her, though inside I wasn't as certain. They'd held their masks tighter than most. Wolfe would need more than arithmetic. He'd need proof, and Saul Panzer was the one man who could deliver it. I went to the phone again. Saul answered before the second ring, and his voice was brisk. He had trailed Drew after he left Sorrel's house. Drew had met someone briefly in Central Park, too brief to identify, but the handoff was obvious. An envelope exchanged quickly. Drew had then gone downtown into a building that housed a law office registered to none other than Roderick Vale. Saul was still watching. That news made the whole picture lean. Sorrel for money, Vale for legality, Adler for pliancy, Gresham for ambition. A coalition maybe, but coalitions crack, and Wolfe would pry it open until one name fell out. I hung up and gave Wolfe the report. He let a thin smile crease his face, then closed his eyes again. "Good. The fault line is visible. By tonight it will rupture. Until then, Archie, keep your eyes open. These people are desperate, and desperation breeds foolishness. If they attempt tampering here, I want to know before they set foot on the stoop." That was my cue. I checked the locks, made sure the phone line was clear, and kept my notebook ready. The game was tightening, and with Wolfe, that meant the end was already in sight, even if the suspects couldn't see it yet. Saul called at 7:15. His voice had the dry snap of a page turned at the good part. He'd shadowed Drew again, first to a storefront watch repair on Lexington where Drew picked up a small wrapped parcel and signed LD on a claim stub, then to a bench in the park where he met a woman in a dark coat. Saul couldn't get her face, just the angle of a jaw and the way she didn't sit. She issued instructions, standing. After that, Drew walked straight to Vale's office, was admitted after hours by a secretary with the nerves of a colt, and left carrying nothing. Saul, being Saul, didn't waste the trip. He got a picture through the glass of the secretary, feeding a carbon into a typewriter with the firm's letterhead on the roller. Later, Drew returned to Sorrel's brownstone by the side door and came out lighter. No portfolio. Saul retrieved a wastebasket offering in the alley. A torn carbon of a receipt with the same line breaks as the one Drew had slid across the penumbra table, and an envelope with LD penciled on and a banker's clip still attached. The clip bore a grease pencil mark. MS, retainer. I carried the bundle in and gave Wolfe the highlights and the detritus. He took each piece between two fingers like it might smudge his dignity. Minerva watched him with the stillness of a scale finding level. Klein had moved from the corner to the edge of his chair as if a half-inch closer to Wolfe would weight the odds. "They will come," Wolfe said without opening his eyes. "Culprits always prefer the illusion of control. They will think how adroit to swing my office to their spectacle." He sighed. "Fools. Archie, show them in when they arrive. Fritz, the beer." At 8 on the nose, they came back. Vale, briefcase fat. Sorrel, collar already blooming with damp. Adler, grey and pinched, and Gresham, in a coat that declared neutrality and meant war. I took them to their chairs, and Wolfe let the silence draft them into honesty before he said a word. "You arranged a morality play," Wolfe began, "because you feared a prosecution. Symbols are so convenient. They seem to carry meaning without admitting intent, but theatricals require stagehands. You have left their fingerprints." His eyes found Sorrel first. "Your house was Mr. Drew's kennel. You fed him money. Mr. Panzer observed his entry and exit and retrieved your clip. The grease mark, MS retainer, is yours. You funded pressure." Sorrel's handkerchief tried to keep up with his face and failed. He made a noise that could have been a denial if his throat hadn't lost the trick. Wolfe shifted to Vale. Your office typed the receipts. Your secretary rolled your letterhead into your machine at your instruction. Mr. Panzer photographed her doing so. Your profession teaches you to pad vice with phrasing. You padded. Vale's fingers whitened on the briefcase clasp. My secretary, often drafts routine. Pfui, Wolfe said, gentle as a hammer. Routine receipts for extortion. Save your craft for a judge. He turned his head a fraction toward Adler. And you? 10 years ago you were bent, and Mr. Klein spared you. Now pliancy again? You muttered where you were told to, enough for Mr. Vale to overhear and place a memory for later misdirection. You are not the author. You are the instrument that squeaks when pressed. Adler's mouth opened and found no air. He lowered his eyes to the rug and left them there. Only Gresham remained, calm as a drawn bow. Wolfe did not look at her yet. He reached instead for the carriage clock on his desk and, with a finger, gently tipped it so the light caught the scratch on the rear plate. "Miss Lake," he said, "you observed yesterday that this is the penumbra's original. You also noted its regulation, losing 1 minute every 20. Minerva inclined her head. "Yes." Therefore, Wolfe continued, when its sender wrote to be opened at tea time and do not attempt to wind, 2 injunctions, he betrayed not expertise but fear of mishandling. A horologist would not instruct so clumsily. A patron would. He let that breathe and then finally turned the beam of his gaze to Eleanor Gresham. "Madam, you needed a lever to pry Mr. Klein's hand from the Finch. Your boardmanship is competent, but donors orbit him, not you. Scandal would unseat him. A capitulation would tarnish him. Either result suited you. You engaged Sorel to finance this effrontery. He already had reason to covet the chronometer on behalf of a client who had lent him too much rope. You engaged Mr. Vale to wrap your bullying in paper. You cowed Mr. Adler with memories of his earlier disgrace, and you chose a symbol you thought would amuse the penumbra while you squeezed. But symbols demand a mechanic. You are not one." Gresham's eyes were very bright. "You overstate me. You accuse because you dislike women who do not curtsy to your routines." Wolfe's lids drooped to kindness. "I accuse because an artisan's bill is in Mr. Panzer's hand. He lifted a slip Saul had passed me at the door and held it out between 2 fingers. Horst MBN, Lexington. 1 adjustment to carriage movement, regulation per client's request. Slow, 60s, 20 medours. Paid in cash. Date, yesterday, 11 a.m. The claim ticket is signed LD. But the shopkeeper remembered the client who came first to commission the work and sent the boy. She wore a dark green suit and a disdain for questions. He described your ring. Her gaze broke then, not with panic, with calculation. She weighed denial against retreat and found both wanting. "Even if I had," she said evenly, "why would I imperil the Finch I serve?" Sorrel, who had been navigating his sweat and failing, blurted, "Because you said it would never go public, that Klein would fold before we had to." Then he saw her eyes and clapped a damp hand over his own mouth. Too late. Vale half rose, briefcase clutched, then sat, because where do you go in that room? Wolfe sighed. There is the coalition laid bare. Purse, paper, pliancy, and primacy. Your mechanism, Madam Gresham, depended on everyone performing as you cast them. Mr. Klein declined too. Miss Lake rerouted your prop to my table, and Mr. Panzer, being a better stagehand, found the ropes. Klein's voice, when it came, had rocks in it. You used my daughter. Her laugh made her a lever, Wolfe said not unkindly. The cynical often mistake innocence for weakness. It is their oldest error. Gresham's jaw firmed. If this is your grand revelation, Mr. Wolfe, where is your proof that I ordered any blackmail? A bill for regulation, a photograph of a typist. Perhaps you should try the newspapers. See how they enjoy your arithmetic. Wolfe did not indulge her with heat. He set the clock upright and folded his hands. Your proof will arrive presently. Mr. Panzer is escorting Mr. Drew here. He will bring his portfolio. In it is a second receipt, unsigned, on your stationery from the Penumbra. Your steward supplied it at your request, to be left in the club's safe as authorization for the transfer, should Mr. Klein not attend in person. He paused. It bears your secretary's watermark, which I obtained by the simple expedient of asking Mr. Goodwin to call and flatter her about the quality of their paper and ask for a sample. She is competent but vain. Vanity is a pantry that never runs out. Eustace can say a room goes quiet, but this one lay down and listened to its heartbeat. Gresham stared, then smiled, tiny and real. You're bluffing. The front bell rang. I went and opened. Saul came in with Drew ahead of him, not rough but not courteous either. Drew's grey suit had lost its starch. He clutched his portfolio like a raft. Saul nodded once to Wolfe and set the portfolio on the desk. Mr. Drew, Wolfe said, you have been paid from 2 directions. Mr. Sorrell's retainer clip says so. Now it appears your commission extended to falsifying receipts on Mr. Vale's letterhead and planting authorization in the Penumbra's safe on Mrs. Gresham's behalf. That last document, if you please. Drew's eyes darted, looking for a gap in walls that had been there 40 years and weren't about to move. He tried to lie and found his tonsils in the way. He opened the portfolio with fingers that had given up, and I took out the top document. It was what Wolfe had promised. Penumbra Stationery, typed authorization to temporarily transfer custody of the English chronometer to Mr. Lyman Drew, intermediary, with a blank where the signatory name belonged. The watermark in the corner matched the sample Wolfe had slid into a drawer an hour before. There were faint indentations beneath the blank line. Gresham had practiced her signature and decided not to risk it. Vale saw the indentations and closed his eyes. That concludes the entertainment, Wolfe said. Mr. Goodwin, call Inspector Kramer. He is, I believe, in need of a case that does not begin with a corpse. Kramer doesn't love coming to the brownstone for anything that smells like choreography. He came anyway. He listened, grunted, turned the receipt over twice, questioned Saul and Drew, snapped at Sorrell until the man's handkerchief surrendered, and left with the portfolio under his arm and 3 people who had discovered that dignity is not an umbrella in a hard rain. When the front door closed on the procession, the house exhaled. Klein stood very still and then sat, suddenly old. Iris slipped in from the stairs, face washed and careful, and Minerva rose to meet her. Wolfe watched them as a botanist might watch a delicate plant recover from a draught. Klein cleared his throat. Mr. Wolfe, I'm not accustomed to owing men anything but money. You have my money. You also have my thanks. Wolfe inclined his head a quarter of an inch. Do not be absurd. You owe me only the courtesy of understanding what you have learned. And what is that? Klein asked, weary and curious both. That institutions, Wolfe said, are clocks with too many hands. Most tell the hour, some tell themselves. When the hour displeases them, they try to stop it. They cannot. They can only pretend. The remedy is not to smash the clock, Mr. Klein, nor to surrender it to those who covet it, but to keep a truer time and be seen to keep it. Appearances, you told me, would condemn you. They need not, if your habits are as honest as your protestations. That was Wolfe's benediction, which was generous for him. He closed his eyes, which does not mean he wasn't seeing us. Minerva looked at him, then at me. I thought bringing the clock here would make me the author of a different play. You did, I said. You changed the theater. That's often enough. Iris came to the desk and put a hand on the carriage clock's glass, then took it away like she'd touched something alive. Will it ever tick again? If you choose to wind it, Wolfe said, it will. I advise leaving it as it is until Mr. Kramer decides whether it is evidence. In any case, It has already performed its function. It taught you who was willing to move your hands. Fritz appeared in the doorway with the timing only Fritz and church bells possess. "Dinner," he announced, as if the word hadn't been invented for this moment. The aroma of roast beef came in like an apology. Klein rose, steadier now. "Will you join us, Miss Lake?" "Iris?" Minerva glanced at Wolfe, who had not invited and never does. "We'll take our leave after," she said softly, "if we're welcome." Wolfe opened one eye. "You are guests. Eat." We ate. Kramer called once, between soup and the roast, to say Drew had begun to talk, and that the repair woman had already identified Gresham by her ring and her temper. Wolfe said satisfactory, which in his vocabulary is a garland. When I hung up, he took another square of cornbread and spoke toward the ceiling. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "if you will remind me tomorrow, I should like to return the clock to the Penumbra with a note advising them that if they must play with time, they hire a better director." "I'll write it tonight," I said. "You can sign in the morning." After dinner, the Kleins left with Minerva. On the stoop, Iris turned and said, "Thank you." I meant it the way people mean a thing when they've just learned how much it costs to say it. I told her to keep her laughter. It had done its job. Back in the office, the carriage clock sat square on the desk, the hands where Minerva had first found them. I straightened the blotter because someone has to make a ceremony of endings. Wolfe shifted a fraction deeper into the chair. He spoke once more, not to me, but to the room. "People," he said, "are forever moving their hands to suit their appetites. Time does not oblige, it only exposes." He closed his eyes. "Fritz, the coffee." I poured mine black and hot and made a note for the morning. The house settled. Outside, the city kept its own indifferent pace. Inside, our clock didn't tick. It didn't have to. 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 It didn't have